When we're stressed, we dwell on past regrets or future anxieties. Mindfulness encourages us to live in the present. By staying present, we see stress as an experience unfolding in real time, rather than amplifying it by reliving the past or worrying about the future. This ancient wisdom speaks directly to the heart of our modern struggles, doesn't it? Buddha recognized that our suffering often stems not from what's happening right now, but from where we allow our minds to wander. There's a beautiful story from the early teachings about a woman named Kisagami who came to Buddha carrying her dead child, begging him to restore her son to life. Her grief was consuming her, creating such intense stress and anguish that she couldn't accept reality. Buddha, with infinite gentleness, told her he could help, but first she needed to bring him a handful of mustard seeds from a house where no one had ever died. Eagerly, Kisagami went from house to house, but in each home, she discovered stories of loss, of beloved family members who had passed away. Gradually, she understood that death and suffering were not punishments targeting her alone, but universal experiences that connect all beings. Compassion also extends to recognizing everyone experiences stress. This understanding makes us feel interconnected, which is a source of strength. When Kisagami returned to Buddha, she no longer carried that desperate, isolating grief. Instead, she had found peace in understanding that her suffering was part of the larger tapestry of existence, shared by all who love and live. Your own stress and anxiety, friend, are not signs of weakness or failure. They're simply evidence that you're alive, that you care deeply about your life and the people in it. But Buddha taught that while suffering is inevitable, our relationship with that suffering can be transformed completely. Buddhist teaches us nothing is truly permanent. This insight reduces the fear and helplessness accompanying stress, as we understand no positive or negative state lasts forever. Embracing impermanence provides hope and resilience, allowing us to realize the waves of stress rise and fall. This isn't merely philosophical comfort, it's practical wisdom you can apply right now to whatever challenges you're facing. Think about it, even the most intense anxiety you've ever felt eventually passed, didn't it? The sleepless night gave way to dawn, the overwhelming deadline was eventually met or passed, the relationship crisis either resolved or transformed into something else entirely. Nothing in your experience has remained static. This impermanence that sometimes frightens us is actually our greatest ally in dealing with stress. There's another story that illustrates this beautifully. A king once asked his wise counselor to find him something that would make him happy when he was sad, and sad when he was happy. After much searching, the counselor returned with a simple ring engraved with the words, "This too shall pass." Buddha would have smiled at this wisdom, recognizing in it the profound truth of impermanence that he taught throughout his life. Buddhist philosophy offers a unique perspective on stress, viewing it as an opportunity for inner growth. Through mindfulness, acceptance, and compassion, Buddhism provides practical tools for transforming our relationship with stress, helping us cultivate resilience and peace. Notice how Buddha doesn't promise to eliminate stress from your life, but rather offers to transform how you relate to it. This is perhaps the most radical and hopeful message you can receive today. Let's explore what this transformation actually looks like in practice. When stress arises, and it will arise, because you're human and alive and engaged with life, the first Buddhist principle is not to fight it or judge yourself for experiencing it. Buddhism emphasizes compassion for ourselves and others. Practicing self-compassion during stress softens our inner dialogue and reduces self-judgment. This means speaking to yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a beloved friend who was struggling. Imagine a dear friend calling you in distress about a work deadline, a family conflict, or financial worry. Would you tell them they're weak for feeling stressed? Would you criticize them for not handling things better? Of course not. You'd listen with compassion, perhaps offer practical help, and remind them of their strength and resilience. This is exactly the voice Buddha encourages you to cultivate toward yourself. Mindfulness of the breath is especially helpful in working with anxiety. Through meditation practice we learn about our own breath patterns, how our breathing changes from fast to slow, shallow to deeper, from tight to free-flowing, depending on our thoughts and emotional state. As we become familiar with these variations, we are able to work with the breath as a healing force. If we feel anxious, we can deliberately regulate our breathing until it is slow and steady. We can drop the habit of holding and tightening our breathing. Your breath is always with you, a faithful companion that can anchor you in the present moment when your mind wants to spiral into worry. Buddha taught that the breath is like a gentle mother, always there to soothe and comfort when you turn your attention to it. Right now, as you read these words, notice your breathing. Don't try to change it initially, just observe it. Is it shallow or deep? Quick or slow? Held or flowing freely? There's a meditation from the early Buddhist texts where practitioners are instructed to breathe in knowing they're breathing in, and breathe out knowing they're breathing out. It sounds almost too simple to be helpful, but this practice has supported countless people through their darkest moments of anxiety and stress. The power lies not in complexity, but in the profound simplicity of returning to what's actually happening right now rather than what might happen tomorrow or what went wrong yesterday. Mindfulness is about learning to slow down. When we are hit with something stressful, often our first response is to panic and speed up. But if we inject even a tiny disruption into that pattern, even a tiny little pause, we can regain our bearings. We can re-establish our ground. This pause Buddha speaks of is like creating a small space of sanctuary within the storm. You don't need to make the storm stop, you just need to find your center within it. Sometimes this pause might be as brief as 3 conscious breaths before responding to a stressful email. Sometimes it might be stepping outside for a moment to feel the air on your face when a conversation becomes overwhelming. The length matters less than the intention to interrupt the automatic reaction of panic and speed. Consider the story of Angulimala, a man who had become consumed with violence and rage, creating incredible stress and fear wherever he went. When he encountered Buddha walking calmly along a path, Angulimala demanded that Buddha stop. Buddha replied, "I have stopped, Angulimala. When will you stop?" This wasn't just about physical movement, it was about the mental and emotional rushing that creates so much of our suffering. Mindfulness practice can also help us cut through the loops of anxious thinking, changing our relationship to the uncertainty that feeds that process. These loops of anxious thinking are like well-worn paths in the mind. The more we walk them, the deeper they become, until it feels like we have no choice but to follow them. But Buddha's insight is that we always have a choice about where we place our attention. We can learn to step off those worn paths of worry and create new pathways of peace and clarity. Buddha often used the metaphor of training a wild elephant to describe the process of working with an anxious mind. Just as an elephant trainer uses patience, consistency, and gentle firmness rather than violence or force, we can learn to guide our minds toward greater peace without being harsh with ourselves. Buddhist meditation can significantly reduce stress, anxiety, and depression. Practices like vipassana improve self-awareness and emotional regulation, while metta meditation boosts positive emotions and empathy, enhancing overall mental well-being. The word metta means loving kindness, and this practice might be one of the most healing approaches you can offer to your stressed and anxious heart. When you're caught in cycles of worry, your entire system becomes contracted and defensive. Metta practice is like gently opening your hands after they've been clenched in fists for too long. There's immediate relief and a sense of spaciousness returning. Here's how Buddha suggested practicing loving kindness when stress arises. First, offer yourself the sincere wish to be happy, to be peaceful, to be free from suffering. Not because you've earned it or deserve it more than anyone else, but simply because you're a living being capable of both suffering and joy. Then extend this same wish to someone you love easily, perhaps a family member or close friend. Next, include someone neutral, perhaps a cashier at the store or a neighbor you barely know. Finally, and this is where the practice becomes truly transformative, extend loving kindness even to someone who has caused you stress or difficulty. This progression teaches your heart that peace and kindness are not scarce resources that must be hoarded, but abundant qualities that expand when shared. Interestingly, meditation and mindfulness, although shown by the study to be highly effective coping strategies, were not as effective as practicing loving kindness, right understanding, and impermanence, which jointly scored 3.1 out of a possible 4.0 for effectiveness, compared to a joint 3.0 for meditation and mindfulness. The most effective coping strategies are therefore cultivating loving kindness, metta, or being non-judgmental, compassionate, kind to oneself and others. This research confirms what Buddha taught 25 centuries ago, that kindness and understanding are more powerful than even the most sophisticated techniques for calming the mind. When you approach your stress and anxiety with genuine friendliness rather than resistance, something magical happens. The stress doesn't necessarily disappear immediately, but your relationship with it transforms completely. Buddha once described the mind under stress as being like muddy water in a glass. The more you shake the glass, trying to make the water clear, the muddier it becomes. But when you simply stop shaking it and allow the glass to rest, the mud naturally settles to the bottom and the water becomes clear on its own. This is the power of non-resistance that loving kindness practice cultivates. The Buddhist approach to stress management emphasizes mindfulness, acceptance, and compassion. Notice how acceptance is included alongside mindfulness and compassion. This doesn't mean passively accepting harmful situations or not working to improve your life. Rather, it means accepting the reality of this moment as the starting point for any positive change you want to create. When you're anxious about a job interview tomorrow, acceptance means acknowledging that yes, you feel nervous, and that's completely understandable. From this place of honest recognition, you can then take practical steps, prepare for the interview, get a good night's sleep, practice calming breathing, from a place of clarity rather than panic. Resistance to the anxiety only adds a layer of suffering on top of the original stress, like being upset about being upset. Stress and anxiety are like unwelcome house guests who show up without invitation, but Buddha suggests we can learn to relate to them with a kind of gracious hospitality rather than slamming the door in their faces. This doesn't mean we have to like them or invite them to stay forever, but we can recognize that fighting them often gives them more power over us than simply acknowledging their presence while continuing to live our lives with intention and kindness and wisdom. There's a profound teaching story about a monk who lived in a forest monastery where wild animals would sometimes wander through the grounds. One evening, as he sat in meditation, a large tiger appeared and settled down just a few feet away from him. The other monks later asked if he had been terrified, and he replied, "Fear arose, yes, but I didn't become fear. The tiger was there, fear was there, and I was there, watching both with curiosity rather than identification." This story reveals something essential about the Buddhist approach to difficult emotions like stress and anxiety. You don't have to become your stress, even when you're experiencing it intensely. There's a part of you that can observe the stress, notice its qualities and characteristics, without being completely consumed by it. This observing awareness is what Buddha called our Buddha nature, that part of us that remains fundamentally peaceful and clear even in the midst of life storms. Buddhist teachings recognize the truth that everything changes, particularly our emotional states. When experiencing intense anxiety or stress, it's beneficial to recall that strong emotions always pass. We can learn from them, however difficult they may be to endure, always remembering that they will change. Anxiety has its place. It can warn us of danger or alert us to respond to a situation. However, when anxiety becomes excessive or obsessive, it can render us ineffective. The key is developing wisdom about when stress is serving you and when it's simply creating unnecessary suffering. Think about the last time you felt genuinely anxious about something that turned out fine, or worried extensively about an outcome that never materialized. Your nervous system was activated, your sleep may have been disrupted, your digestion affected, your relationship strained, all for something that existed only in your imagination of possible futures. Buddha wasn't criticizing this very human tendency, but rather offering tools to help you distinguish between useful concern that motivates appropriate action and destructive worry that depletes your energy without solving anything. One of the most liberating insights from Buddhist psychology is understanding the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is what happens to us, the difficult circumstances, the losses, the challenges that are inevitable parts of being alive. Suffering is what we add to pain through our resistance, our stories about what the pain means, our projection into the future about how long it might last or how much worse it might get. There's a teaching tale about two arrows that illustrates this beautifully. Buddha explained that when we're struck by the first arrow of pain, perhaps receiving difficult news, facing a health challenge, or experiencing relationship conflict, we then often shoot ourselves with a second arrow of suffering by our mental reactions to the pain. The first arrow hurts, certainly, but the second arrow can cause agony that far exceeds the original wound. Mindfulness and a greater acceptance of our stress and anxiety helps reduce the fight-flight-freeze responses that our autonomic nervous system can trigger when it detects danger. By remaining present and aware, rather than being swept away by catastrophic thinking, we can respond to stressors from a place of wisdom rather than react from a place of panic. Your body's stress response evolved to help you survive immediate physical dangers, but it can't distinguish between a charging tiger and a challenging email from your boss. When your heart rate increases and your breathing becomes shallow because you're thinking about tomorrow's presentation, your nervous system is trying to help you run or fight, even though neither response is appropriate for the situation. Buddhist mindfulness practice teaches you to recognize these bodily sensations as information rather than commands, allowing you to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Consider practicing what Buddha called noting when you notice stress arising. Instead of immediately trying to fix or eliminate the stress, simply note to yourself, stress is here, or anxiety is present, or worry is arising. This simple practice creates a tiny bit of space between you and the experience, reminding you that you are not your stress, you are the awareness that can observe stress coming and going. There's a wonderful story about Nagarjuna, one of the great Buddhist philosophers, who was once asked by a student how to deal with overwhelming fear and anxiety. Instead of offering complex philosophical explanations, Nagarjuna simply said, "Notice that you are afraid. Notice that your heart is beating fast. Notice that your breathing has changed. Now notice who is doing the noticing." This pointing to awareness itself is one of the most direct ways to find stability within instability, peace within turbulence. Buddhism encourages followers to develop wisdom, compassion, and the means to help others, in addition to personal well-being. When we're caught up in our own stress and anxiety, we naturally become more self-focused and less able to be present for others. But paradoxically, one of the most effective ways to ease our own suffering is to reach out and offer support to someone else who is struggling. This doesn't mean ignoring our own needs, but rather recognizing that we're all interconnected in our human experience of difficulty and resilience. Sometimes when you're spiraling in worry, the most healing thing you can do is call a friend who's been having a hard time, volunteer for a cause you care about, or simply hold the door open for a stranger with genuine warmth. These small acts of connection remind you that you're part of something larger than your own problems, and they activate the compassionate heart that Buddha taught was your true nature. There's a story about Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion, who vowed to help all beings free themselves from suffering. When Avalokiteshvara saw the enormity of suffering in the world, the task seemed so overwhelming that his head split into countless pieces from the stress and despair. But rather than giving up, each piece became a new head with which to see suffering more clearly, and each head sprouted multiple arms to offer help more effectively. This story suggests that even our breakdowns can become breakthroughs when approached with compassion and wisdom. Your own stress and anxiety can become sources of greater empathy and understanding, not just obstacles to overcome. When you've experienced the tight chest of anxiety, you recognize it immediately in others. When you've known the spiral of worried thoughts, you can offer genuine understanding to someone caught in their own mental loops. Your difficult experiences become resources for connection and healing, both for yourself and others. Buddhist meditation practices often begin with developing concentration and stability of mind, but they ultimately lead to insight about the nature of reality itself. One of the most profound insights is recognizing that many of our stresses come from fighting against the fundamental characteristics of existence: impermanence, uncertainty, and lack of complete control. We stress about losing what we have because we've forgotten that everything is temporary anyway. We anxiety about uncertain outcomes because we're trying to control what is inherently uncontrollable. We suffer when we can't make others behave the way we want them to because we've misunderstood the nature of independence and interdependence. When you truly understand and accept these basic truths about life, much of your stress naturally dissolves, not because your circumstances change, but because you stop demanding that reality be different from what it is. There's a famous Zen teaching about a farmer whose horse ran away. His neighbors came to console him, saying, "What terrible luck." The farmer simply replied, "Maybe." The next day, the horse returned with several wild horses following it. The neighbors congratulated him on his good fortune, and again he said, "Maybe." When his son tried to train one of the wild horses and broke his leg, the neighbors offered sympathy for this misfortune, and the farmer said, "Maybe." Soon after, soldiers came through the village conscripting young men for war, but they passed over the farmer's son because of his broken leg. The neighbors remarked on how fortunate this was, and the farmer said, "Maybe." This story illustrates the Buddhist understanding that our stress often comes from our premature judgments about whether events in our lives are good or bad. The farmer's equanimity wasn't indifference or denial, but rather a deep wisdom about the interconnected and constantly changing nature of all experiences. He understood that joy and sorrow, gain and loss, praise and blame are all temporary experiences that flow through our lives like weather patterns across the sky. Buddhist teachings on the middle way offer particularly helpful guidance for dealing with stress and anxiety. The middle way isn't about finding a lukewarm compromise between extremes, but rather discovering a balanced approach that avoids both the extreme of complete indulgence in our anxious thoughts and the extreme of trying to suppress or eliminate all difficult emotions. When Buddha first began teaching after his enlightenment, he encountered many people who had tried to solve their life problems through various forms of extremism, severe asceticism, total sensual indulgence, rigid rule following, or complete rejection of all structure. He had experimented with these approaches himself and found that they only created different forms of suffering. The middle way he discovered and taught was a path of wise discernment that honored both the reality of human limitations and the possibility of genuine freedom. In practical terms, this means neither panicking when stress arises nor pretending that you don't feel stressed when you clearly do. It means taking appropriate action when action is called for, while also accepting the aspects of situations that are beyond your control. It means caring deeply about outcomes while holding lightly to your attachments to specific results. Practicing the middle way with stress and anxiety requires developing what Buddha called right effort, not too tight, not too loose, like tuning the strings of a musical instrument. If the strings are too loose, you can't make music. If they're too tight, they break. But when they're tuned just right, beautiful music becomes possible. Your relationship with stress and anxiety can be tuned in this same way, finding the balance between caring and letting go that allows your life to flow with greater harmony and ease. The Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths provides a complete framework for understanding and working with stress and anxiety. The first noble truth acknowledges that stress, dissatisfaction, and suffering are inherent parts of human existence. This isn't pessimistic, but rather realistic. When you stop expecting life to be free of difficulty, you can learn to work skillfully with difficulty when it arises. The second noble truth identifies the cause of suffering as our craving, grasping, and attachment to having things be different from how they are. Much of our stress comes from wanting permanence in an impermanent world, certainty in an uncertain existence, and complete control over experiences that are only partially within our influence. The third noble truth offers the hopeful message that it's possible to be free from the kind of suffering we create through our own mental habits and reactions. This doesn't mean becoming emotionless or detached from life, but rather developing a way of engaging with life that includes joy and sorrow, success and failure, ease and difficulty without adding unnecessary layers of resistance and story-making that amplify our pain. The fourth noble truth outlines the Eightfold Path, a practical set of guidelines for cultivating wisdom, ethical conduct, and mental cultivation that leads to greater peace and freedom. Each aspect of the path offers specific tools for working with stress and anxiety. Right understanding helps us see clearly what we can and cannot control. Right intention guides us toward responses that are helpful rather than harmful. Right speech encourages communication that heals rather than wounds. Right action supports choices that align with our deepest values rather than our immediate impulses. Right livelihood suggests engaging in work that contributes to well-being rather than exploitation. Right effort teaches the balance between caring and letting go. Right mindfulness develops present moment awareness that prevents us from amplifying current difficulties with stories about the past or future. And right concentration cultivates the mental stability that allows us to remain centered even during challenging circumstances. These 8 aspects of the path work together like the spokes of a wheel, each one supporting and strengthening the others. When you're experiencing intense stress or anxiety, you might find it helpful to consider which spoke might offer the most support in that particular moment. Sometimes what you need most is the clarity of right understanding, recognizing that your current difficulty is temporary and workable. Other times, you might benefit from the practical guidance of right action, taking concrete steps to address whatever aspects of the situation are within your influence. There's a beautiful teaching story about a woman named Patakara who lost her husband, children, and parents in a series of tragic events. Her grief and trauma were so overwhelming that she wandered the countryside in a state of complete mental breakdown, unable to care for herself or make sense of what had happened to her life. When she encountered Buddha, she was barely recognizable as the accomplished person she had once been. Instead of offering platitudes or trying to minimize her pain, Buddha simply sat with her in compassionate silence until she was ready to receive his guidance. He then taught her about the nature of impermanence, not as an abstract philosophical concept, but as a lived reality that could help her understand her experience. He helped her see that while the pain of her losses was real and valid, the additional suffering she was creating through her resistance to the reality of what had happened was optional. Gradually, through patient practice of mindfulness and loving kindness, Patakara was able to transform her overwhelming grief into a deep wisdom that she then shared with many others who were facing similar losses and traumas. This story illustrates something crucial about the Buddhist approach to intense stress and emotional crisis. There's no spiritual bypassing or pressure to get over it quickly. Instead, there's an invitation to meet your pain with the same compassionate presence that Buddha offered to Patakara. Your stress and anxiety deserve this kind of gentle, patient attention rather than the harsh criticism or impatient demands for quick fixes that our culture often promotes. Buddhism distinguishes between 2 types of happiness: hedonic well-being, which comes from pleasure and avoidance of pain, and eudaimonic well-being, which comes from meaning and self-realization. Buddhist practices primarily cultivate eudaimonic well-being, providing a sustainable source of contentment that doesn't depend on external circumstances. This distinction helps explain why simply trying to avoid or eliminate stress often doesn't lead to lasting peace, while learning to find meaning and growth through difficulties can create genuine resilience and joy. When you understand this distinction, you can begin to see your current stress not as evidence that something is wrong with your life, but as an opportunity to develop the kind of deep, unshakable contentment that Buddha called true happiness. This doesn't mean seeking out stress or being grateful for every difficulty, but rather recognizing that the same challenging experiences that can cause suffering can also be catalysts for wisdom and compassion when approached with skillful means. Consider the story of Angulimala, whose name meant necklace of fingers, because he had been killing people and collecting their fingers as trophies. He had become trapped in a cycle of violence and rage that created immense stress and fear, both for himself and everyone around him. When he encountered Buddha walking alone through the forest, Angulimala saw an opportunity for another victim. But as he chased after Buddha, he found that no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't catch up, even though Buddha appeared to be walking at a normal pace. Finally, in frustration, Angulimala called out for Buddha to stop. Buddha turned and said, "I have stopped, Angulimala. When will you stop?" This exchange marked the beginning of a profound transformation. Buddha wasn't just talking about physical movement, but about the mental and emotional running that keeps us trapped in cycles of stress and reactivity. Angulimala's enlightenment came through learning to stop, to pause the automatic patterns of violence and anger that had dominated his life. Your own patterns of stress and anxiety might not be as dramatic as Angulimala's story, but the principle is the same. Much of our suffering comes from mental and emotional running, the constant movement away from present moment experience toward worry about the future or regret about the past. Learning to stop, even for a moment, creates the possibility for a completely different relationship with whatever is happening in your life right now. Buddha taught that all conditioned existence is characterized by three fundamental qualities: impermanence, suffering, and non-self. Understanding these characteristics directly, not just intellectually but through lived experience, can transform your relationship with stress and anxiety in profound ways. Impermanence reminds you that no matter how intense your current difficulties feel, they will change. Suffering helps you recognize that trying to create a life completely free from challenge and discomfort is both impossible and unnecessary for true happiness. Non-self reveals that much of our stress comes from defending and protecting an identity that is actually much more fluid and spacious than we typically imagine. The teaching on non-self is particularly relevant for working with anxiety, which often involves a hypervigilant protection of the ego against perceived threats. When you really examine what you call yourself, you discover that it's actually a constantly changing flow of thoughts, emotions, sensations, and experiences rather than a solid, separate entity that needs defending. This doesn't mean you don't exist or that your experiences don't matter, but rather that you exist as part of an interconnected web of relationships and conditions rather than as an isolated individual fighting against the world. There's a meditation practice from the Thai forest tradition where practitioners are encouraged to contemplate their bodies as being composed of elements, earth, water, fire, and air, that are borrowed from the natural world and will eventually return to it. This contemplation can be deeply calming for anxious minds because it reminds you that you're not separate from the natural world but are a temporary manifestation of the same elements that make up mountains, rivers, trees, and stars. When you remember that your body is made of water that has flowed through countless beings, air that has been breathed by infinite forms of life, earth that has nurtured plants and animals for millions of years, and fire that shares the same energy as the sun, your personal stress begins to feel less overwhelming and more workable. You're not an isolated problem that needs fixing, but rather a beautiful, temporary expression of the same intelligence and creativity that moves through all of nature. Buddhist philosophy encourages developing equanimity, which is the ability to remain balanced and composed regardless of external circumstances. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally flat or indifferent, but rather cultivating a deep inner stability that allows you to remain responsive rather than reactive during challenging times. Equanimity is like being a mountain during a storm. The weather moves around and over you, but your fundamental ground remains steady and unmoved. Developing equanimity requires practice and patience, but it begins with small moments of choosing to pause before reacting to stressful situations. Instead of immediately responding to triggering emails, taking a few breaths and considering your response. Instead of spiraling into worry when unexpected changes occur, taking a moment to acknowledge your anxiety while also connecting with your deeper wisdom about impermanence and your capacity to handle whatever comes. There's a practice called just sitting in Zen Buddhism where practitioners simply sit in meditation without any particular goal or technique, just allowing whatever arises in consciousness to come and go naturally. This practice can be especially helpful for people dealing with anxiety because it teaches you to be comfortable with not knowing, not controlling, and not fixing. You learn to trust your own basic awareness and resilience rather than constantly trying to manage your experience through mental effort. In daily life, you can cultivate this same quality of just being with your stress and anxiety. Instead of immediately trying to figure out solutions or escape from uncomfortable feelings, you can practice simply being present with whatever is happening without needing to change it right away. This doesn't mean becoming passive or avoiding appropriate action, but rather approaching your challenges from a place of groundedness rather than panic. Buddhist teachings on loving kindness extend beyond meditation practice to include how we speak to ourselves during difficult times. The internal dialogue that accompanies stress and anxiety is often harsh and critical, adding layers of shame and self-judgment to already challenging circumstances. Buddha encouraged practitioners to cultivate the same kind voice toward themselves that they would offer to a beloved friend or family member in distress. Next time you notice yourself caught in anxious thinking, try shifting from, "What's wrong with me for feeling this way?" to, "This is a difficult moment, and it makes sense that I'm feeling stressed." Instead of, "I should be handling this better," try, "I'm doing the best I can with the resources I have right now." This shift from self-criticism to self-compassion isn't just feel-good psychology, it actually creates the emotional safety that allows your nervous system to calm down and your thinking to become clearer. The practice of loving kindness also includes forgiveness, both of yourself and others who may have contributed to your stress. This doesn't mean condoning harmful behavior or pretending that hurtful actions didn't matter, but rather releasing the additional suffering you create by carrying resentment and blame. Forgiveness is ultimately a gift you give to yourself, freeing up the mental and emotional energy that gets tied up in old grievances so that it can be available for creating positive change in your life. There's a powerful story about two monks walking together who came to a river where a young woman was stranded, unable to cross safely on her own. One monk immediately offered to carry her across, despite their monastic vows about avoiding contact with women. After setting her safely on the other side, the monks continued their journey. Hours later, the second monk could no longer contain his concern and said, "How could you touch that woman? You know it's against our vows." The first monk replied, "I put her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" This story illustrates how much additional stress we create by mentally carrying past events long after they've ended. Your anxiety often involves carrying mental representations of future threats or past hurts that exist only in your imagination. Learning to put down these mental burdens through mindfulness and forgiveness can provide immediate relief and create space for more peace and joy in your present moment experience. Buddha taught that the mind is naturally luminous and clear, but it becomes clouded by what he called adventitious defilements, temporary mental states like greed, hatred, and delusion that obscure our true nature. Stress and anxiety are similar clouds that pass through the sky of consciousness, but they're not the sky itself. Even in your most anxious moments, there's an aspect of your awareness that remains untouched by the turbulence, like the blue sky that's always present behind even the stormiest weather. Meditation practice helps you recognize and rest in this natural clarity and spaciousness that is your birthright. You don't have to create peace, you only have to stop creating disturbance. This understanding can be tremendously liberating because it means that your true nature is already peaceful and whole. The stress and anxiety you experience are temporary visitors in the space of your consciousness, not permanent residents or fundamental flaws in your character. This recognition shifts everything about how you approach difficult emotions. Instead of seeing yourself as someone who has anxiety or is stressed, you begin to understand yourself as spacious awareness within which various experiences arise and pass away. This isn't just philosophical wordplay, it's a fundamentally different way of experiencing your life that can bring immediate relief and long-term transformation. There's a meditation instruction from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that suggests relating to thoughts and emotions like clouds passing through the sky. You wouldn't think of the sky as being damaged or permanently changed by the presence of clouds, no matter how dark or stormy they might appear. Similarly, your essential awareness remains unmarked by even the most intense experiences of stress or anxiety. The clouds come and go, but the sky endures, vast and accommodating. Practicing this perspective doesn't mean becoming detached or uninvolved in your life, but rather engaging with your experiences from a place of greater stability and wisdom. When you know that you are the sky rather than the weather, you can respond to challenges with more creativity and less reactivity. You can care deeply about outcomes while simultaneously holding lightly to your attachments to specific results. Buddhist psychology recognizes that attachment is one of the root causes of suffering, but it's important to understand what attachment actually means in this context. Attachment isn't the same as caring, loving, or being engaged with life. Rather, attachment refers to the desperate clinging that tries to make permanent what is naturally impermanent, or to control outcomes that are only partially within our influence. You can love your family deeply without being attached to them never changing or experiencing difficulties. You can care passionately about your work without being attached to specific recognition or outcomes. You can take excellent care of your health without being attached to never getting sick or aging. This distinction between caring and clinging is crucial for understanding how to live fully while also maintaining the inner freedom that Buddha taught was possible for all beings. When stress arises around relationships, career, health, or any other life domain, it's helpful to examine whether you're experiencing appropriate concern that motivates skillful action, or attachment-based anxiety that creates suffering without solving problems. Appropriate concern feels focused and energizing, leading naturally to helpful responses. Attachment-based anxiety feels scattered and draining, often leading to rumination, control behaviors, or emotional reactivity that makes situations worse rather than better. There's a teaching story about a Zen master whose house burned down while he was away. When he returned to find nothing but ashes where his home had been, his students expected him to be devastated. Instead, he sat quietly among the ruins for a while, then stood up and said, "What a beautiful place to build a new house." His response wasn't denial or spiritual bypassing, but rather a demonstration of non-attachment that allowed him to see possibility within loss, growth within destruction. This story doesn't suggest that you should feel happy when difficult things happen, or that you shouldn't grieve losses and mourn changes. Rather, it points to the possibility of meeting whatever arises in your life with openness and curiosity rather than resistance and despair. Even the most challenging experiences contain seeds of wisdom and transformation when approached with the kind of spacious awareness that Buddhist practice cultivates. One of the most practical aspects of Buddhist stress management is the emphasis on ethical conduct, or what Buddha called right action. Much of our stress comes from living in ways that conflict with our deeper values and wisdom. When we act from greed, hatred, or delusion, even in small ways, we create internal friction that manifests as anxiety, guilt, regret, and various forms of emotional turbulence. Conversely, when our actions align with compassion, wisdom, and genuine care for the well-being of ourselves and others, we create internal harmony that supports natural peace and contentment. This doesn't mean being perfect or never making mistakes, but rather developing the sensitivity to notice when we're moving away from our values and the commitment to gently redirect ourselves toward greater alignment. Consider how you feel internally when you speak harshly to someone in frustration, versus how you feel when you respond to that same frustration with patience and kindness. Notice the difference in your body, your energy, your sleep, and your general sense of well-being. The choice to act from wisdom rather than reactivity isn't just morally preferable, it's also practically beneficial for your own mental health and stress levels. Buddha taught 5 basic ethical precepts that serve as guidelines for reducing the kind of stress that comes from harmful actions: refraining from killing or harming living beings, refraining from taking what isn't freely given, refraining from sexual misconduct, refraining from false or harmful speech, and refraining from intoxicants that cloud judgment and awareness. These aren't rigid rules imposed from outside, but rather wise guidelines that emerge naturally from understanding how actions create consequences in both your external life and your internal experience. Each of these precepts can be understood broadly and applied to modern life in ways that significantly reduce stress and increase well-being. Refraining from harm includes not only avoiding obvious violence, but also being mindful of how your words, attitudes, and even thoughts might cause injury to yourself or others. Refraining from taking what isn't given includes respecting others' property, time, attention, and emotional energy rather than manipulating or exploiting for personal gain. Sexual misconduct encompasses any sexual behavior that involves dishonesty, betrayal of trust, or harm to others, recognizing that sexual energy is powerful and affects not just the people directly involved but their families, communities, and society as a whole. False or harmful speech includes not only obvious lies, but also gossip, harsh words, and communication that divides rather than heals. Avoiding intoxicants supports the clarity of mind needed to make wise choices and respond skillfully to challenging situations. When you live according to these principles, you naturally create less drama and conflict in your external life, which reduces stress from external sources. More importantly, you create internal alignment between your actions and your wisdom, which eliminates the stress that comes from knowing you're not living according to your own best understanding. There's a story about a businessman who came to a Buddhist teacher complaining about the stress of his work life. He described the pressure, competition, and ethical compromises he felt forced to make in order to succeed. The teacher listened compassionately, then asked, "If you could design your work life to align completely with your values, what would it look like?" As the businessman described his vision of ethical business practices, generous treatment of employees, and products that truly served customers' well-being, he realized that much of his stress came not from external pressures but from his own choices to act in ways that conflicted with his deeper wisdom. This story illustrates how stress often serves as internal guidance, alerting us when we're moving away from our authentic values and priorities. Instead of just trying to manage stress symptoms, Buddhist practice encourages us to listen to what our stress might be telling us about needed changes in how we're living our lives. Buddhist meditation includes various techniques specifically designed to work with difficult emotions like stress and anxiety. One particularly helpful practice is called RAIN. Recognize what is happening in your experience right now, allow whatever you're feeling to be present without immediately trying to fix it, investigate the experience with kindness and curiosity, and natural awareness that comes from not identifying completely with temporary emotional states. This four-step process can be practiced in formal meditation or applied informally throughout daily life whenever you notice stress or anxiety arising. The beauty of RAIN is that it honors both the reality of difficult emotions and your capacity to work with them skillfully. You're neither suppressing feelings nor being overwhelmed by them, but rather developing a wise relationship with the full spectrum of human experience. Recognition involves simply noticing and naming what you're experiencing without judgment. Anxiety is here, or I'm feeling stressed about this situation. This step sounds simple, but it's actually quite sophisticated because most of the time we're partially unconscious of our emotional states, reacting automatically rather than responding consciously. Allowing means creating space for whatever you're feeling without immediately rushing to change it. This goes against our usual habits of trying to fix, avoid, or analyze difficult emotions, but it creates the emotional safety that allows natural healing and wisdom to emerge. Allowing doesn't mean wallowing or indulging in drama, but rather offering the same patient presence to yourself that you would offer to a good friend who was going through a hard time. Investigation involves gently exploring your experience with curiosity rather than judgment. Where do you feel the stress in your body? What thoughts are accompanying the anxiety? What does this experience need from you right now? This isn't analytical thinking, but rather a kind, attentive presence that helps you understand your experience more deeply. Natural awareness refers to the spacious consciousness that can observe all these thoughts, emotions, and sensations without being completely identified with any of them. From this perspective, you can see that stress and anxiety are temporary experiences moving through awareness rather than permanent characteristics of who you are. Buddha often used the metaphor of a skilled doctor to describe the spiritual path. A good doctor doesn't judge patients for being sick, but rather accurately diagnoses what's happening and prescribes appropriate medicine. Similarly, Buddhist practice involves accurately diagnosing the causes of our suffering and applying appropriate remedies with patience and skill. When stress and anxiety are diagnosed through this lens, they're often found to be symptoms of deeper issues, trying to control what can't be controlled, resisting the natural changes that are part of life, identifying too completely with temporary mental and emotional states, or living in ways that conflict with our deeper wisdom and values. The medicine isn't to eliminate these symptoms by force, but rather to address the underlying causes through mindfulness, compassion, wisdom, and ethical living. Sometimes the medicine you need is more formal meditation practice to develop mental stability and clarity. Sometimes it's more time in nature to remember your connection to the larger web of life. Sometimes it's honest conversation with trusted friends to gain perspective on your challenges. Sometimes it's making concrete changes in your lifestyle, relationships, or work to create better alignment with your values. The key is developing the sensitivity to know what medicine is most needed in each situation. Buddhist teachings on interdependence offer a particularly helpful perspective for working with stress and anxiety. When we feel overwhelmed by our problems, we often feel isolated and alone, as if we're the only ones struggling or as if our difficulties are evidence of personal failure. Understanding interdependence helps us recognize that our challenges are arising from countless causes and conditions, most of which are completely beyond our control. Your current stress might be influenced by your childhood experiences, your genetic predisposition, your cultural conditioning, the political climate, economic conditions, your relationships, your work environment, your health, and countless other factors stretching back to the beginning of time. This isn't meant to make you feel powerless, but rather to relieve you of the burden of thinking that you should be able to single-handedly solve all your problems or that your difficulties mean something is fundamentally wrong with you. At the same time, interdependence also means that your responses to stress and anxiety ripple out and affect others in ways you might not fully realize. When you practice patience with yourself during difficult times, you model emotional wisdom for your family and friends. When you respond to challenges with kindness rather than reactivity, you contribute to creating a more compassionate world. When you take care of your mental and emotional well-being, you have more resources available to support others who are struggling. This understanding of interconnectedness can transform your relationship with personal struggle from something shameful that should be hidden to something that connects you more deeply with the universal human experience of challenge and growth. Every person you encounter today has experienced stress, anxiety, loss, and uncertainty. Your willingness to meet your own difficulties with compassion and wisdom creates a field of healing that extends far beyond your individual life. There's a beautiful story from the Jataka tales about Buddha in a previous lifetime as a merchant who encountered a terrible storm while crossing the ocean with a ship full of precious cargo. As the waves grew higher and the wind grew stronger, the other merchants became increasingly panicked, throwing their goods overboard and arguing about what to do. But this particular merchant remained calm and centered, not because he didn't care about the outcome, but because he understood that panic would only make the situation worse. His steady presence had a calming effect on everyone around him. Gradually, the other merchants stopped their frantic activity and began working together more skillfully to navigate the storm. The boat didn't magically become safe, and the storm didn't immediately subside, but their collective response became much more effective. Eventually they weathered the storm and reached shore safely, not because one person solved all their problems, but because one person's wisdom and equanimity created space for everyone's best responses to emerge. Your own practice of meeting stress with mindfulness and compassion has this same ripple effect. You don't have to become perfect or eliminate all anxiety from your life to be a positive influence. Simply practicing the intention to respond rather than react, to breathe rather than hold your breath, to speak kindly rather than harshly, creates waves of beneficial influence that touch everyone in your sphere of contact. Buddhist psychology recognizes that much of our stress comes from what are called the 8 worldly concerns: gain and loss, pleasure and pain, praise and blame, fame and disgrace. These four pairs represent the natural ups and downs of human existence, but we create additional suffering when we cling to the positive experiences and resist the negative ones, or when we tie our sense of self-worth to external circumstances that are constantly changing. Consider how much mental energy you spend trying to ensure gain rather than loss, pleasure rather than pain, praise rather than blame, good reputation rather than criticism. This effort isn't inherently wrong, but when it becomes the primary focus of your life, it creates a constant underlying stress because you're essentially fighting against the natural rhythm of existence, which includes both sides of each pair. Buddha taught that true peace comes from learning to meet both sides of these experiences with equanimity, celebrating gains without clinging to them, accepting losses without despair, enjoying pleasures without addiction, enduring pain without bitterness, receiving praise without pride, handling criticism without defensiveness, appreciating recognition without attachment, and facing obscurity without self-pity. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally flat or indifferent to your life circumstances. You can still have preferences, work toward goals, and care deeply about outcomes while simultaneously holding the wisdom that all external conditions are temporary and that your fundamental well-being doesn't depend on things going according to your plans. There's a practice from Tibetan Buddhism called Lojong, or mind training, that specifically works with transforming difficult experiences into sources of wisdom and compassion. One of the Lojong slogans is, "When the world is filled with evil, transform all mishaps into the path of awakening." This isn't about positive thinking or spiritual bypassing, but rather about developing the skill to use even the most challenging circumstances as opportunities for growth. When you're experiencing intense stress or anxiety, you can practice asking yourself, how might this difficulty be serving my spiritual development? What qualities is this situation asking me to cultivate? How might working skillfully with this challenge help me become more wise and compassionate? These questions don't minimize the reality of your pain, but they help you find meaning and purpose within the struggle that can transform suffering into strength. Another Lojong teaching suggests driving all blames into oneself, which sounds masochistic until you understand its actual meaning. This practice isn't about taking inappropriate responsibility for things that aren't your fault, but rather about looking for how you might be contributing to your own suffering through mental habits, reactions, or choices, rather than staying stuck in blaming external circumstances for your distress. When you're stressed about a relationship conflict, instead of focusing exclusively on what the other person is doing wrong, you might examine how your own expectations, communication patterns, or attachment to specific outcomes are contributing to the situation. This shift empowers you to make changes that are actually within your control rather than waiting for others to behave differently. Buddhist meditation practices include specific techniques for working with strong emotions that can be particularly helpful during periods of intense stress or anxiety. One such practice is called Tonglen, or giving and receiving, where you practice breathing in suffering and breathing out relief, both for yourself and others. This might sound counterintuitive when you're already feeling overwhelmed, but Tonglen actually helps prevent the additional suffering that comes from resisting or fighting against difficult emotions. The practice works by first connecting with your own experience of stress or anxiety, breathing it in fully rather than trying to escape from it. Then, on the exhale, you offer yourself the qualities you most need, perhaps peace, courage, understanding, or support. After working with your own experience, you expand the practice to include others who might be experiencing similar difficulties, breathing in their stress and breathing out relief for all beings who struggle with anxiety and overwhelm. Tonglen practice helps dissolve the sense of isolation that often accompanies emotional distress. Instead of feeling like you're the only one suffering or that your pain is somehow special or wrong, you begin to see your experience as part of the shared human condition that connects you with countless others. This shift from isolation to connection often provides immediate relief and opens your heart to both self-compassion and compassion for others. Buddha taught extensively about the relationship between mental states and physical health, recognizing that stress and anxiety affect not only our emotional well-being but also our bodies, our relationships, and our ability to think clearly and make good decisions. Buddhist approaches to stress management include attention to all these dimensions rather than treating mental health as separate from physical health or individual healing as separate from community well-being. From a Buddhist perspective, the body is not just a physical machine but a sensitive instrument that reflects our mental and emotional states and can also influence those states. When you're anxious, your breathing becomes shallow, your muscles tense, your digestion may be disrupted, and your sleep patterns affected. These physical changes then send signals back to your nervous system that can intensify the anxiety, creating cycles that maintain stress even when the original trigger has passed. Buddhist body awareness practices help interrupt these cycles by developing sensitivity to the early physical signs of stress and learning to respond before the patterns become entrenched. This might involve noticing when your shoulders start to rise toward your ears during a difficult conversation and consciously relaxing them. It might mean recognizing when your breathing becomes constricted while reading stressful news and taking a few moments to breathe more fully. These practices aren't about controlling your body or forcing it to behave differently, but rather about creating a friendly relationship with your physical experience and learning to work cooperatively with your body's wisdom rather than against it. Your body has enormous capacity for healing and self-regulation when it's supported by conscious awareness and loving attention. There's a story about a monk who developed a chronic illness that caused him constant physical discomfort and prevented him from sitting in meditation for long periods. Instead of fighting against his condition or feeling sorry for himself, he began using his physical experience as a meditation object, observing the sensations with the same patient attention he had previously given to his breath. Through this practice, he developed profound insights about impermanence, non-self, and the nature of suffering that might never have arisen through conventional meditation alone. This story illustrates how Buddhist practice can transform any experience, even physical pain and limitation, into sources of wisdom and liberation. Your stress and anxiety, while certainly uncomfortable, can become teachers that help you develop qualities you might never have cultivated otherwise: patience, humility, compassion, resilience, and a deep appreciation for the preciousness of peace and ease when they arise. Buddhist communities, known as Sangha, provide crucial support for practicing these teachings in daily life. While meditation and study are important, Buddha emphasized that spiritual development happens most effectively in the context of relationships with others who share similar values and intentions. The stress and anxiety that arise in isolation often become workable when shared with understanding friends who can offer perspective, encouragement, and practical support. This doesn't necessarily mean joining a formal Buddhist community, although that can be helpful for some people. Sangha can be created wherever you gather with others to discuss meaningful questions, support each other's growth, or practice together in any way that serves wisdom and compassion. It might be a book club that reads spiritual texts, a walking group that discusses life challenges, a volunteer organization that serves others in need, or simply regular conversations with friends who share your interest in living with greater awareness and kindness. The healing power of Sangha comes partly from the relief of discovering that you're not alone in your struggles, and partly from the opportunity to practice the Buddhist teachings in real relationship with others. It's one thing to cultivate patience and compassion in meditation, and another thing entirely to practice these qualities when someone disagrees with you, disappoints you, or triggers your defensive reactions. Sangha provides the laboratory where wisdom gets tested and refined through lived experience. Buddha often spoke about the three jewels of Buddhism: Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, representing the teacher, the teachings, and the community of practitioners. Taking refuge in these three jewels means finding support for your spiritual development through inspiration from wise teachers, study and practice of helpful teachings, and connection with others who are walking similar paths. During periods of intense stress or anxiety, any of these three can provide the stability and guidance needed to work skillfully with whatever you're experiencing. Taking refuge in Buddha doesn't necessarily mean converting to Buddhism or accepting specific religious beliefs, but rather connecting with the inspiration of someone who faced the same fundamental human challenges you face and found genuine freedom and peace. Buddha's life story includes periods of luxury and deprivation, success and failure, certainty and confusion, just like yours. His awakening came not from escaping from human experience but from learning to work with it so skillfully that he found unshakable peace within the midst of constant change. Taking refuge in Dharma means studying and practicing teachings that support wisdom, compassion, and liberation from unnecessary suffering. These teachings might come from Buddhist sources, or they might come from other wisdom traditions, science, literature, or your own direct experience. The key is approaching whatever you study with the intention to reduce harm and increase benefit for yourself and others. Taking refuge in Sangha means cultivating relationships that support your highest intentions rather than enabling your reactive patterns. This includes choosing friends who encourage your growth, participating in activities that align with your values, and creating environments that make it easier to practice patience, generosity, honesty, and other qualities you want to develop. These three refuges work together to create a supportive context for transforming stress and anxiety from sources of suffering into opportunities for awakening. When you feel overwhelmed by current circumstances, you can remember that wise beings throughout history have faced similar challenges and found ways to respond with skill and grace. You can draw upon teachings and practices that have helped countless people navigate difficulty with greater ease. And you can reach out to others for support, or offer support to others, recognizing that healing happens in relationship rather than isolation. The Buddhist understanding of karma offers another helpful perspective for working with stress and anxiety. Karma is often misunderstood as a system of cosmic punishment and reward, but it's actually much more practical and hopeful than that. Karma simply means that actions have consequences, and that present moments are shaped by past actions while simultaneously creating conditions for future experiences. From this perspective, your current stress and anxiety are arising from countless causes and conditions, many of which are completely beyond your control. You're not being punished for past mistakes, and you don't deserve to suffer. At the same time, how you respond to your current difficulties will influence future conditions, both for yourself and others. This understanding can relieve guilt and blame while simultaneously empowering skillful action. When you understand karma in this way, you can work with your stress and anxiety without adding layers of judgment about why these experiences are happening to you or what they mean about your spiritual progress. Instead, you can focus your energy on responding as wisely as possible to whatever is arising, knowing that each moment of patience, kindness, and awareness creates beneficial conditions that will ripen in ways you may never fully see or understand. There's a profound teaching story about a farmer who discovered that his prize bull had died during the night, representing a significant financial loss that created immediate stress about how to manage his farm and support his family. His neighbors gathered to express sympathy for his misfortune, but the farmer simply said, "We'll see." The next day, the farmer learned that his neighbor's bull had also died, and that neighbor offered to sell his remaining cattle at a very fair price. Again, the neighbors commented on his good fortune, and again the farmer said, "We'll see." This pattern continued through various ups and downs. The farmer's son was injured but avoided military conscription because of the injury. A drought destroyed crops but revealed a hidden spring on his property. Political changes created new opportunities but also new challenges. Through each event, the farmer maintained the same response, "We'll see." His wisdom lay in recognizing that any single event is part of a much larger web of causes and effects that extends far beyond what we can perceive in any given moment. This story points to one of the most liberating insights of Buddhist practice, that you don't need to figure everything out or understand why things are happening in order to respond skillfully to whatever is arising. Your stress and anxiety might be arising for reasons you'll never fully understand, involving causes and conditions stretching back through generations and forward into possibilities you can't imagine. But you can still choose to respond with kindness, wisdom, and appropriate action based on your best understanding of what's helpful in this moment. Buddhist teachings on the nature of mind offer particularly profound support for working with anxiety and worry. Buddha taught that the mind has two primary aspects: the moving, changing aspect that includes all our thoughts, emotions, plans, and reactions, and the still, aware aspect that can observe all this mental activity without being swept away by it. Most people identify completely with the moving aspect, which is why emotional turbulence feels so overwhelming and personal. But when you learn to recognize and rest in the still, aware aspect of mind, even intense anxiety becomes much more workable. It's like the difference between being caught in river rapids and standing on the riverbank watching the rapids flow by. The water is still rushing and turbulent, but your relationship to it is completely different when you're not being tumbled around by it. This doesn't mean disconnecting from your emotional life or becoming indifferent to what happens to you. The still awareness is not cold or detached, but rather spacious and compassionate, able to hold all experiences with tender presence. From this perspective, you can feel deep concern about important matters while simultaneously maintaining inner peace, experience sadness about losses while also feeling gratitude for what remains, acknowledge fear about uncertain outcomes while also trusting your capacity to handle whatever actually occurs. There's a meditation practice called sky-like mind that helps cultivate this perspective. You imagine your awareness as vast like the sky, and your thoughts and emotions as clouds moving through that sky. Sometimes the clouds are light and wispy, like peaceful thoughts and gentle emotions. Sometimes they're dark and stormy, like anxiety and stress. But regardless of the weather, the sky itself remains unchanged, spacious, clear, and accommodating to whatever appears within it. This practice can be especially helpful during anxiety attacks or periods of intense stress when it feels like there's no space around your experience. By consciously expanding your sense of awareness to be sky-like, you create room for even the most intense emotions without being completely overwhelmed by them. The anxiety is still present, but it's held within something much larger and more stable. Buddhist philosophy includes extensive teachings on the nature of time and how our relationship with past and future creates unnecessary suffering in the present moment. Most anxiety involves either regret and rumination about past events or worry and anticipation about future possibilities. While it's natural and sometimes helpful to learn from the past and plan for the future, these mental activities become sources of stress when they dominate present moment awareness. Buddha taught a practice called presence of mind that involves repeatedly returning attention to immediate sensory experience whenever you notice your mind has wandered into past or future concerns. This isn't about suppressing thoughts about past and future, but rather about not losing yourself completely in mental time travel when direct engagement with present reality would be more helpful and less stressful. Right now, for example, as you're reading these words, your body is sitting or lying somewhere, probably breathing regularly, possibly surrounded by various sounds, textures, temperatures, and other sensory experiences. This immediate reality is actually quite manageable and often quite peaceful, even when your mind is spinning stories about past mistakes or future disasters. Learning to anchor awareness in present moment sensory experience provides a refuge from the mental storylines that create much of our emotional turbulence. There's a story about a meditation student who complained to her teacher that her mind was constantly filled with anxious thoughts about her job, her relationships, her health, and various world events. The teacher asked her to describe what was happening in her immediate environment, the feeling of air moving in and out of her lungs, the sounds of birds outside the window, the texture of her clothes against her skin, the taste still lingering in her mouth from her morning tea. As the student began describing these simple present moment experiences, her breathing naturally deepened, her shoulders relaxed, and her facial expression softened. The teacher pointed out that her anxious thoughts were still available if she wanted to return to them, but they were no longer dominating her experience. This simple shift from mental activity to sensory awareness had created space for both the thoughts and something much more peaceful to coexist. Buddhist teachings on compassion extend to include how we relate to our own mental habits and emotional patterns. Many people add significant stress to their lives by judging themselves harshly for experiencing anxiety, as if feeling stressed were evidence of spiritual failure or personal weakness. This self-judgment creates what Buddhist psychology calls second-level suffering, suffering about suffering that often causes more distress than the original difficulty. Developing compassion toward your own anxiety means recognizing that these feelings arise from your deep care about life, your loved ones, and your responsibilities. Your stress is often evidence of your conscientiousness, sensitivity, and engagement with matters that truly matter to you. While the anxiety itself might not be pleasant, the caring that underlies it reflects beautiful qualities of heart that deserve appreciation rather than criticism. This doesn't mean indulging in anxiety or using self-compassion as an excuse to avoid making helpful changes in your life. Rather, it means approaching your emotional experience with the same kindness you would offer to a good friend, creating the emotional safety that allows natural healing and wisdom to emerge. When you stop fighting against your anxiety and instead meet it with understanding, it often transforms naturally into more helpful emotions like appropriate concern, motivated action, or peaceful acceptance. Buddhist practice includes specific techniques for working with the physical symptoms of anxiety that often persist even when you understand the mental and emotional aspects intellectually. These practices recognize that anxiety lives in the body as much as in the mind, and that lasting relief requires addressing both dimensions of the experience. One such practice involves systematically relaxing different parts of the body while maintaining awareness of your breathing. You might begin with your feet, consciously releasing any tension you notice there, then move slowly upward through your legs, pelvis, back, arms, shoulders, neck, and face. This isn't about forcing relaxation, but rather about offering your body permission to soften and let go wherever it's ready to do so. As you practice this body awareness, you might notice that anxiety creates specific patterns of tension in your particular system, perhaps tightness in your chest, clenching in your jaw, or holding in your belly. Learning to recognize these patterns early gives you the opportunity to interrupt the anxiety cycle before it becomes overwhelming. Sometimes simply breathing into areas of tension and offering them gentle attention can prevent stress from escalating into full-blown anxiety attacks. Buddhist teachings on energy work recognize that anxiety often involves a dispersion or agitation of life energy that can be calmed through specific practices. One helpful technique involves imagining that your energy is like water that has been stirred up and is gradually settling into stillness. You don't need to do anything active to make this settling happen. You simply need to stop stirring and allow the natural tendency toward equilibrium to restore itself. This settling of energy often happens naturally when you spend time in peaceful environments like gardens, forests, or near bodies of water. But you can also cultivate this quality internally through meditation practices that emphasize stillness and gathering rather than analysis or effort. Simply sitting quietly and allowing your attention to collect itself, like particles settling to the bottom of a glass of muddy water, can provide profound relief from the scattered feeling that often accompanies anxiety. The Buddhist understanding of refuge includes finding safety and support not only in external communities and teachings, but also in your own fundamental Buddha nature, the innate wisdom, compassion, and freedom that exists within every being regardless of current circumstances or emotional states. Even in your most anxious moments, this deeper nature remains untouched and available as a source of strength and guidance. Connecting with this inner refuge doesn't require believing in specific Buddhist doctrines, but rather involves learning to trust the part of yourself that remains calm even when your mind is agitated, that continues to care even when you feel disconnected, that retains clarity even when you're confused about specific decisions or outcomes. This isn't about positive thinking or self-deception, but about recognizing the deeper stability that makes it possible for you to observe your anxiety rather than being completely identified with it. There's a practice from the Zen tradition called just sitting, that involves resting in this fundamental awareness without trying to achieve any particular state or solve any particular problem. You simply sit with whatever is arising in your experience: anxiety, peace, boredom, insight, physical discomfort, mental clarity, or any combination of these, without needing to change anything or get anywhere else. This practice can be profoundly healing for people who are used to constantly trying to fix their anxiety or improve their emotional state. Just sitting teaches you that you're already okay exactly as you are, even when you're experiencing difficult emotions. The anxiety might still be present, but it's no longer a problem that needs to be solved before you can be at peace. Peace becomes available right within the midst of whatever you're experiencing. Buddhist teachings on death and impermanence offer perhaps the most powerful antidote to anxiety, though they require courage and honesty to engage with deeply. Most anxiety ultimately stems from trying to create security and permanence in a world where everything is constantly changing and where loss is inevitable. When you truly accept the reality of impermanence, not just intellectually but in your bones, much of your stress naturally dissolves because you stop fighting against the fundamental nature of existence. This doesn't mean becoming morbid or depressed about mortality, but rather finding the strange freedom that comes from accepting uncertainty as the only certainty. When you know that everything you currently have will eventually be lost, you can appreciate it more fully while you have it without the desperate clinging that creates so much suffering. When you know that you can't control outcomes completely, you can focus your energy on responding skillfully to whatever arises rather than exhausting yourself trying to manage the unmanageable. Buddha taught that contemplating death regularly, not in a morose way, but as a practice of awakening to the preciousness and fragility of life, can transform your priorities and reduce the anxiety that comes from taking temporary things too seriously. This might involve reflecting on how brief human life is compared to geological time, or considering how many of the things you worried about last year have already been forgotten, or simply remembering that everyone you've ever met will someday die, including yourself. These contemplations aren't meant to frighten or depress you, but rather to put current stresses in perspective and help you focus on what truly matters. When you remember that your time here is limited and precious, you might find yourself less willing to waste energy on trivial worries and more motivated to live with authenticity, kindness, and appreciation for the extraordinary gift of being alive at all. There's a teaching story about a woman who approached Buddha in great distress because she couldn't stop worrying about all the terrible things that might happen to her family. Buddha listened with compassion, then asked her to imagine that she had only one day left to live. "How would you spend those 24 hours?" he asked. As she described wanting to hold her children, express her love to her husband, appreciate the beauty of sunrise and sunset, and feel gratitude for all the good things in her life, she realized how much energy she was wasting on fears about imaginary futures instead of embracing the love and beauty that were actually available to her right now. This shift in perspective didn't eliminate all her concerns about her family's well-being, but it helped her distinguish between appropriate care that motivated helpful action and destructive worry that prevented her from enjoying the very relationships she was anxious about protecting. She learned to hold both simultaneously, genuine concern for her loved ones' welfare and deep appreciation for their presence in her life exactly as they were in each moment. Buddhist practices for working with anxiety include cultivating what are called the Brahmaviharas, or divine abodes, loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. These are not just pleasant emotions to experience occasionally, but rather stable qualities of heart that can be developed through practice and that provide natural protection against the mental states that create unnecessary suffering. Loving kindness practice begins with offering genuine good wishes to yourself. May you be happy, may you be healthy, may you be at peace, may you live with ease. This isn't just positive thinking, but rather a sincere cultivation of the kind of warm regard you naturally feel for someone you care about deeply. When you can offer this quality of friendliness to yourself consistently, it becomes much harder for anxiety to take root because you're creating internal conditions of safety and support. Extending loving kindness to others, family members, friends, neutral people, difficult people, and eventually all beings everywhere, helps dissolve the sense of separation and isolation that often fuels anxiety. When you remember that everyone you encounter is struggling with their own challenges and deserves happiness and peace, your own problems feel less overwhelming and more manageable. You're not alone in your difficulties, and your well-being is connected to the well-being of countless others. Compassion practice involves recognizing suffering wherever it appears and responding with the wish to help alleviate it. This includes being compassionate toward your own anxiety rather than adding judgment and resistance that make it worse. When you can see your stress as a form of suffering that deserves the same compassionate attention you would offer to anyone else in pain, you naturally become more gentle and skillful in how you work with it. Sympathetic joy involves learning to appreciate good fortune wherever you encounter it, rather than comparing your circumstances to others or feeling envious when others seem to have what you lack. This practice is particularly helpful for anxiety that stems from comparison and competition, reminding you that there's enough happiness to go around and that others' success doesn't diminish your own possibilities for fulfillment. Equanimity represents the culmination of these practices, a stable, peaceful presence that can remain balanced regardless of external circumstances. Equanimity isn't indifference or emotional numbness, but rather a deep acceptance that allows you to care fully while also letting go completely. From this perspective, you can work diligently for positive outcomes while simultaneously accepting whatever results actually occur. These four qualities work together to create what Buddha called an unshakable heart, not because you become invulnerable to life's challenges, but because you develop the inner resources to meet whatever arises with wisdom and grace. Your anxiety doesn't disappear, but it loses its power to dominate your experience because you have access to much more stable and nourishing emotional states. Buddhist teachings on wisdom include understanding what Buddha called the two truths, conventional truth and ultimate truth. Conventionally, your problems are real, your anxiety matters, and it makes sense to take appropriate action to care for your well-being and address challenging situations. Ultimately, however, all experiences are temporary, interdependent, and empty of the solid, permanent existence they appear to have. This teaching helps prevent both the extreme of taking your anxiety so seriously that it becomes overwhelming and the extreme of dismissing your concerns as unreal or unimportant. Both levels of truth are valid and useful. You can work skillfully with your stress on the conventional level while simultaneously holding the ultimate perspective that reminds you not to take temporary experiences too seriously or identify with them too completely. There's a story about a master calligrapher who was commissioned to write an important document for a wealthy patron. He worked for days on the project, but each time he was nearly finished, he would notice a small imperfection and start over completely. His student watched this process with growing frustration and finally asked why he kept discarding work that was already quite beautiful and functionally adequate. The master replied, "On one level, this document is extremely important and deserves my very best effort. On another level, it's just ink on paper that will eventually fade and be forgotten. If I hold only the first truth, I become paralyzed by perfectionism. If I hold only the second truth, I become careless and sloppy. But when I hold both truths simultaneously, I can work with full dedication while also maintaining perspective and peace." This balance between caring and letting go, between engagement and equanimity, is at the heart of the Buddhist approach to stress and anxiety. You don't have to choose between taking your life seriously and holding it lightly. You can do both, and the combination often leads to both better outcomes and greater inner peace than either approach alone would provide. Buddhist meditation includes practices specifically designed for working with racing thoughts and mental agitation that often accompany anxiety. One such practice involves using a mantra or repeated phrase as an anchor for attention when the mind becomes too scattered to focus on breath or body sensations. Traditional mantras like Om Mani Padme Hum or Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha can be helpful, but you can also use simple English phrases like breathing in peace, breathing out tension, or may all beings be happy and free. The repetition provides a refuge for the mind when it's too agitated to rest in stillness, while the meaning of the words gradually influences your mental and emotional state in beneficial directions. This isn't about suppressing anxious thoughts, but rather about giving your mind something more beneficial to focus on until natural calm returns. Another helpful practice for anxious minds involves what Buddha called noting or labeling mental activities as they arise. When you notice worry beginning, you simply note worrying and return attention to your chosen object of meditation. When planning takes over, you note planning and return to your anchor. This practice helps you recognize how much mental activity is actually optional rather than necessary, and it develops the capacity to disengage from unhelpful thought patterns without fighting against them. Buddhist teachings on energy and effort emphasize finding what Buddha called the middle way between excessive striving and complete passivity. Much anxiety comes from either trying too hard to control outcomes that are partially beyond your influence, or from feeling overwhelmed and not taking action that could genuinely help improve challenging situations. The middle way approach to working with stress involves what Buddha called right effort, energetic engagement that is sustainable, skillful, and aligned with wisdom rather than driven by fear or compulsion. This means taking appropriate action when action is called for, while also accepting the aspects of situations that are beyond your control. It means caring about outcomes without becoming attached to specific results. Learning to discern when effort is helpful and when it's counterproductive requires developing sensitivity to your own energy patterns and honest assessment of what you can and cannot influence in any given situation. Sometimes the most effortful thing you can do is to stop efforting and allow natural processes of healing and resolution to unfold. Other times, sustained action is exactly what's needed to address problems that won't resolve on their own. There's a teaching story about a student who asked a master how to know when to act and when to wait. The master pointed to a tree outside the window and said, "Watch how the tree responds to the wind. When the wind is gentle, the tree barely moves. When the wind is strong, the tree bends gracefully. When the wind is violent, the tree bends almost to the ground if necessary. But the tree never tries to stop being a tree, and it never tries to control the wind. It simply responds appropriately to whatever conditions are present." This story illustrates the kind of responsive flexibility that Buddha taught as an alternative to both rigid control and passive helplessness. Like the tree, you can learn to respond appropriately to whatever conditions are present in your life without losing your essential nature or exhausting yourself trying to control what is uncontrollable. Buddhist philosophy includes extensive teachings on the nature of fear and how it relates to the illusion of separation that creates much of human suffering. Most anxiety involves some form of fear, fear of loss, fear of change, fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of death. While some fear serves the useful function of alerting you to genuine dangers, much of the fear that creates chronic stress is based on the mistaken belief that you are fundamentally separate from and vulnerable to a hostile universe. Understanding interdependence, the teaching that all phenomena arise in dependence upon countless causes and conditions and that nothing exists independently, can provide profound relief from separation-based fears. When you truly understand that you are not a separate, isolated entity trying to survive in an indifferent world, but rather an integral part of an infinitely connected web of relationships, many fears naturally dissolve. This doesn't mean becoming naive about genuine risks or failing to take appropriate precautions, but rather recognizing that your well-being is supported by countless seen and unseen factors, and that you have access to resources and resilience that you may not fully recognize when you're caught in the tunnel vision that anxiety creates. Buddhist practices for working with fear often involve what is called leaning into or making friends with the feared experience rather than avoiding it. This counterintuitive approach recognizes that resistance to fear often creates more suffering than the fear itself, and that many fears lose their power when met with curious, compassionate attention rather than avoidance or fighting. If you're afraid of uncertainty, for example, you might practice deliberately not knowing the answer to questions, sitting with not having plans, or appreciating the mystery and openness that uncertainty actually contains. If you're afraid of loss, you might practice giving things away, contemplating impermanence, or focusing on gratitude for what you currently have rather than anxiety about what you might lose. These practices require courage and should be approached gradually with appropriate support, but they can lead to profound freedom from the kinds of fears that keep many people trapped in cycles of stress and limitation. When you discover through direct experience that you can handle much more than you thought you could, many anxieties naturally fall away. The Buddhist teaching of no-self, or anatman, offers perhaps the most radical perspective for working with stress and anxiety, though it's also one of the most commonly misunderstood concepts in Buddhist philosophy. The teaching doesn't mean that you don't exist or that your experiences don't matter, but rather that what you call self is much more fluid, open, and interconnected than you typically imagine. Most stress comes from defending and promoting a self-image that feels solid and permanent but is actually quite constructed and changeable. When you recognize that this sense of self is more like a flowing river than a solid rock, you can relax the exhausting effort of trying to maintain and protect something that was never as fixed as you thought it was. This recognition can be tremendously liberating for people who experience anxiety about their identity, their role in various relationships, their reputation, or their future security. When you understand that these aspects of self are constantly changing anyway, you can participate in that change more consciously and skillfully rather than anxiously trying to prevent the inevitable. Buddhist teachings conclude not with the elimination of all stress and anxiety, but with the development of wisdom and compassion that can meet whatever arises with skillful grace. The goal isn't to become a person who never feels stressed, but rather to become someone who can work with stress in ways that lead to growth, healing, and service rather than escalating cycles of suffering. This perspective transforms stress from an enemy to be defeated into a teacher that can deepen your understanding of life and expand your capacity for wisdom and love. Your anxiety becomes not a sign of spiritual failure, but rather evidence of your sensitivity and care, raw material that can be transformed through skillful practice into greater compassion for yourself and others who struggle with similar challenges. There's a final story that beautifully illustrates this transformation. A young monk was troubled by persistent anxiety about his spiritual progress and kept asking his teacher when he would finally be free from all worries and fears. The teacher listened patiently to these questions for months, offering gentle guidance and encouragement, but the monk's anxiety only seemed to intensify as he focused more and more on trying to achieve a worry-free state. One day, the teacher invited the monk to walk with him to visit a village that had been affected by flooding. When they arrived, they found families who had lost their homes, children who were hungry, and elderly people who needed medical care. Without hesitation, the monk began helping wherever he could, carrying supplies, comforting frightened children, assisting with cleanup efforts. He worked from dawn to dusk for several days, completely absorbed in responding to the immediate needs around him. It was only on the journey back to the monastery that the monk suddenly realized he hadn't thought about his own anxiety for days. His worries about his spiritual progress seemed irrelevant compared to the genuine suffering he had witnessed and the meaningful ways he had been able to help. The teacher smiled and said, "Now you understand. Freedom from suffering comes not from eliminating all difficulties, but from forgetting yourself in service to something larger than your personal concerns." This story points to one of the most profound insights of Buddhist practice, that much of our stress and anxiety dissolves naturally when we shift our focus from self-centered preoccupation to genuine care for the well-being of others. This doesn't mean ignoring your own needs or problems, but rather holding them within the larger context of universal human experience and finding ways to transform your personal healing into resources for collective healing. When you understand that your anxiety connects you with countless others who struggle with similar fears and uncertainties, you can begin to see your healing process as part of a larger movement toward greater compassion and wisdom in the world. Your willingness to meet your stress with mindfulness and kindness creates ripples of beneficial influence that extend far beyond your individual life. Buddhist practice ultimately offers not escape from the human condition, but rather full engagement with it from a place of wisdom, compassion, and skillful means. You learn to embrace both the joys and sorrows of existence without losing your center, to care deeply about outcomes while holding lightly to specific results, to take appropriate action while accepting what lies beyond your control. This balanced approach allows you to live with what Buddha called an unshakable heart, not because you become invulnerable to life's challenges, but because you develop the inner resources to meet whatever arises with grace and wisdom. Your stress and anxiety don't disappear completely, but they transform from sources of suffering into opportunities for awakening, from personal problems into universal doorways toward greater understanding and love. The practices and perspectives shared in this conversation are not meant to be implemented all at once or mastered quickly. They represent a gradual path of development that unfolds over months and years of patient practice. Some teachings will resonate immediately while others may not make sense until you've had certain life experiences that help you understand them more deeply. This is perfectly natural and expected. Buddha often spoke about the importance of taking only what is helpful from any teaching and leaving the rest until it might become useful later. You don't need to believe everything or practice everything to benefit from Buddhist approaches to stress and anxiety. Simply experimenting with the perspectives and practices that feel most relevant to your current situation can lead to significant relief and positive change. The breath practices, loving kindness meditation, mindfulness of present moment experience, cultivation of self-compassion, understanding of impermanence, and ethical living that have been discussed can each be explored independently and adapted to fit your particular circumstances and preferences. What matters most is not following any specific formula, but rather approaching your stress and anxiety with the intention to respond rather than react, to learn rather than suffer, and to grow in wisdom and compassion through whatever challenges arise. Remember that Buddha himself experienced doubt, fear, and uncertainty before his awakening, and that these experiences were part of what enabled him to understand and help others who faced similar struggles. Your current difficulties are not obstacles to spiritual development but rather the raw material from which awakening emerges. Every moment of conscious breathing during anxiety, every choice to speak kindly when you feel triggered, every decision to reach out for support when you feel isolated contributes to your own healing and to the healing of our shared world. The Buddhist path doesn't promise a life free from stress, but it does offer the possibility of transforming your relationship with stress so completely that even challenging experiences become sources of joy, wisdom, and connection. This transformation happens gradually, through countless small moments of choosing love over fear, awareness over reactivity, and compassion over judgment. As you continue to explore these teachings in your daily life, remember to be patient with yourself and to celebrate small victories along the way. Notice when you're able to take a conscious breath instead of holding tension in your body. Appreciate moments when you respond with kindness instead of irritation. Acknowledge the courage it takes to feel anxious feelings fully rather than numbing or avoiding them. These small shifts in how you relate to your inner experience create the foundation for larger transformations that may unfold in ways and timing you can't predict or control. Trust the process, even when progress feels slow or unclear. The seeds of wisdom and compassion that you plant through practice will bear fruit in their own season, often in ways more beautiful and beneficial than you could have imagined. The invitation that Buddha extends through these teachings is not to become perfect or to eliminate all traces of human vulnerability, but rather to discover the profound peace and freedom that are available right within the midst of ordinary human experience. Your stress and anxiety, when met with the kind of patient, compassionate awareness that Buddhist practice cultivates, become gateways to deeper understanding of yourself and your connection with all life. In moments when anxiety feels overwhelming, remember that you are part of an ancient lineage of human beings who have faced uncertainty, loss, and fear with courage and grace. You have access to the same wisdom and strength that have sustained countless others through their darkest moments. You are never as alone or as helpless as stress and worry would have you believe. The teachings shared here are offerings from one friend to another on the path of awakening. Take what serves you and leave the rest with gratitude for the opportunity to explore together what it means to be human, to suffer, and to find genuine peace and joy within the full spectrum of human experience. May your journey with stress and anxiety become a path of deepening wisdom, expanding compassion, and ever greater freedom from unnecessary suffering. May you find strength in times of challenge, peace in times of turbulence, and wisdom in times of confusion. May your healing contribute to the healing of all beings, and may all beings everywhere be free from stress, anxiety, and fear. May all beings be happy, healthy, and at peace. May all beings awaken to their true nature of wisdom and compassion, and may all beings live with ease and joy in this precious, temporary, and infinitely connected existence we share. These words are offered with deep respect for your courage in facing life's difficulties and with complete confidence in your capacity to transform even the most challenging experiences into sources of awakening and love. The path continues with each conscious breath, each moment of mindfulness, each choice to meet whatever arises with an open and compassionate heart. Research confirms the profound effectiveness of Buddhist approaches to stress and anxiety management. Studies show that mindfulness-based interventions are as effective as traditional psychotherapy for treating anxiety and depression, while Buddhist counseling interventions significantly reduced anxiety scores and helped patients accept unpleasant situations calmly. The scientific evidence supports what practitioners have known for centuries. Individuals engaging in mindfulness practices experience notable reductions in anxiety and depression, improved emotional control, and marked changes in emotional regulation with decreased stress levels. Research on Thai Buddhist meditation found that various meditative styles were positively related to self-esteem and resilience, with negative relationships to anxiety, depression, and stress, showing significant differences between meditation frequencies and mental health outcomes. Particularly encouraging is the finding that practicing meditation, mindfulness, ethical right action, loving kindness, and considering impermanence or karma correlated closely with positive outcomes for stressful events. Additionally, people with high levels of observing the 5 precepts of Buddhism are less likely to develop depressive symptoms, with these practices buffering against depression even in those with high neuroticism and stress levels. The neurological research is equally compelling. Practitioners engaging in long-term Buddhist meditation experience less anxiety, depression, and stress, with extensive research indicating that Buddhist meditation promotes flexible restructuring of brain neural pathways. These findings validate the ancient wisdom shared throughout this conversation, confirming that Buddhist approaches offer not just spiritual comfort but scientifically measurable benefits for those struggling with stress and anxiety. Your journey toward greater peace and freedom is supported by both millennia of contemplative wisdom and contemporary research showing the real, tangible benefits of these practices for mental health and well-being.